At this scale of attack, it will not be much shy of $1 billion worth of effort.
That's why they're called missiles. Missiles. Is that a joke? There were 3 generals in the consulate, and one of them actually ran the Syrian and Lebanese operation for Iran.
So if you shoot it down over a built-up area, a whole load of Jordanians are going to get killed on the ground.
When you've got 300 to 400 missiles coming inbound, you've got missiles from the Iron Dome coming up into the same sort of space or in that sort of area, that you're going to have fighter jets from 1, 2, 3 countries. You've got refueling planes and refueling going on. You may have some sort of surveillance thing, further up. And you've got stuff arriving in the same airspace from ships. How you manage all of that chaos without having a sort of major accident mid-air is pretty amazing.
The difficult thing is these things take time to generate, coordinate, and then make sure everybody's on the same page. And of course, how much notice would they have had of this happening? So I think the really impressive bit of this is how air power and surface-to-air missiles were coordinated at very short notice.
Sure, all hell has broken loose in the Middle East. And it's complicated. But before we get into the detail, I think it'd be worth just summarising what has actually happened. 300 and something missiles.
331, yeah. But before we get into that, what's been fascinating, I've ended up doing a load of interviews the last few days, and all of them seem to start with the Iranian attack on Israel, forgetting, in fact, that actually this current iteration of tit for tat started on the 1st of April. And why is that important? It's important to set some context, that's all. On the 1st of April, although Israel didn't claim responsibility for it, they took out the Iranian consulate in Syria, in Damascus. It was right next to the embassy. They didn't take out the embassy, but the consulate was leveled. And in there were 13 people were killed, including several senior Iranian commanders, in what many reports have suggested was a breach of international law because it has a lot of international rules and regulations around, the sovereignty of embassy buildings and consulate buildings themselves. Now, of course, Israel didn't claim it was responsible for that, but Iran did say at the time, Ayatollah Khomeini, there will be a price to pay for this, and everyone was waiting with bated breath. Now, on Saturday night, I was there, on the verge of midnight. There's already been reports of these missiles being launched, 185 drones, 36 cruise missiles, and 110 ballistic missiles. A total of 331 were launched from a variety of different directions towards Israel.
That's a lot of missiles, but it's also a lot of money.
A huge amount of money. Remember we were talking about some of the waves of Russian attacks.
Yeah.
When you added it up, were about $1 billion worth of attacks.
Yeah.
I haven't done the maths around this, but it's this scale of attack, it will not be much shy of $1 billion worth of effort. But in a way, if you add up the cost of actually shooting it all down as well, the jets, the carrier groups, the missiles, but it appeared that 7 of those ballistic missiles got through. The primary target appears to be the Nevatim air base, which is in southern Israel. Why is that important? Because that's the air base from which the F-35s were launched to do the 1st of April attack on the consulate. Now, did they do any significant damage? It's very difficult to tell, but this airbase, we've got a picture of it, has 3 runways, so it's huge. It's a massive area. It will be very difficult militarily to take it out, and we understand that it didn't stop any operations at all. But what's interesting, I think, despite the huge wave of attacks, help from America, the UK, and other nations helped ensure that the casualty count from that attack, apparently there were no reported deaths, and only casualty was a 7-year-old girl who suffered from shrapnel damage. But the terror effect of these weapons must have been huge.
The logistics interest me because I can understand from an Iron Dome, Israel is one of Israel's defence weapons, how it's always ready. But from putting a plane, the British putting a plane up in the air, I don't know, you seem to have got to know, in a sort of rough idea time-wise, when this is going to happen. Planes aren't just sort of circling for a couple of days, hoping. So that's pretty smart, isn't it?
Well, I think one of the things that I'm always interested about from a military angle is that this sounds like a huge wave of attacks, but it didn't seem to be successful. And part of that is how the West responded. Now, there are three big things here, one of which is how do you detect the launch of missiles, drones, projectiles? How do you track them? Why do you have to track them? You have to track them because they might be in somebody else's airspace, in which case you can't take them out in that airspace. You have to wait for them to arrive in Israeli's airspace. And then how do you target them? And there are three distinct. Now, what you want to have is layered defense. You don't want to wait until everything arrives on your doorstep. Israel's quite a small country, and if you waited till these things arrived at your doorstep before you attacked them,
It's too late.
It'd be completely too late. You'd be overwhelmed. So part of what I think is the unseen part of this is the West's level of support, which would have involved satellite technology to detect launches. Probably would be difficult to detect the launch of the drones, the Shahed 136 drones, but would have been able to detect the launch of ballistic missiles and potentially cruise missiles. And as soon as you've got that detect function, you can now start to predict where the targets are and also
How long it's going to take. So do you wait then before you take off? So your planes are ready. And is it work like this, that you detect the launch or them getting ready to launch? You shout, "Hey, John, get out the canteen and get in your plane. We're off."
Well, it's a combination of things. So part of what you have is this layered defence, but you also have different things on readiness. So you would have had some aircraft in the air. Now, part of the real question here, I think, is how much warning did the Iranians give? So if you wind the clock back to 2020, the last time that America took out a senior Iranian leader, their response was to fire 12 or 13 cruise missiles at 2 US military bases in Iraq. But Iran didn't want to escalate. So they told the Americans these were coming. And as a result, my understanding is that there were no American deaths, and the only casualties were blast of literally shockwaves running around. So how much warning did the Iranians give that this attack was coming? In which case, you can now launch your aircraft, the first wave of aircraft, with air-to-air refueling, and you can also get your US ships that were in the Red Sea all pointing in the right direction, ready to take the barrage. Now, you wouldn't have known how big the barrage was going to be, so you probably have a couple of aircraft already in the right position, and then as it became apparent, you'd have lots of aircraft ready to go with tanker aircraft to refuel them, ready to respond. And it's a layered defence between aircraft, ground-based or ship-based air defence missiles, and then the last line of resort, if these things get through to Israel,
The Iron Dome.
The Iron Dome.
Yeah.
And that's what would have taken out, and that's why we saw quite a lot of pictures of the Iron Dome in action, because if it was me as a military commander doing this, I'd want to take out the ballistic missiles and cruise missiles as far out as I could, because they can cause the most damage.
And they travel the fastest.
And they travel the fastest, whereas the drones, they're more a terror weapon than they are. Yes, they can cause a bit of damage. They can certainly kill people, but they're relatively small warheads, and therefore let the Iron Dome deal with a lot of those, because it's probably going to be ideally suited. And the missiles and the guns are cheaper than these long-range rockets that are being used to intercept.
It's still pretty clever, isn't it? And we've covered this before. I think we're going to see a picture of the missile launched from a ship. But that missile is being launched from a ship and manages to hit this quite small. I mean, they're big, but in terms of space, they're quite small.
They are. I mean, there's two sides to that,
smart.
as you say. One of the technologies is about how do you hit a bullet in flight, because the ballistic missiles are often travelling in excess of the speed of sound. Mark II is roughly the speed of a bullet. So we're talking about trying to strike a bullet in flight. But one of the reasons these things are called missiles is that often they don't hit the target. What they're designed to do is get close to it with a proximity fuse, and the explosion then takes out the bit. So for example, with a missile against an aircraft, often the missile comes alongside the aircraft, and there's a zirconian disc that explodes in a spherical or a cylindrical shape. And that will hit vital parts. Exactly. It doesn't have to destroy the aircraft.
No, it doesn't have to hit it directly.
No.
Is that what you're saying? That's why they're called missiles. Is that a joke?
No, it's not. I mean, it is actually that's part of the way they work. If they had to hit the aircraft, some of them have to, but that's not, you can get close. And then once they get close, there's a sensor that detects that it's close to a target and therefore explodes.
Sean, you mentioned tit for tat earlier. And this makes me come at this from two angles. One is tit for tat means it just goes on, potentially escalates. The second is where it starts. And if you ask Israel where it started, they say, well, actually, it started years ago. If you ask Iran where it started when they bombed the consulate. If you ask a Palestinian where it started with them, they'll say, well, it didn't start on the 7th of October. So it's a kind of a game, who's got the best analysis. Ultimately, though, what do you fear most about what's happening now with the overall Israel conflict, now including Iran directly?
Yeah, it's a big subject, isn't it? I think the current iteration, Iran was very clear with its diplomatic language. It said that the attack on its consulate on the 1st of April, they claimed it was illegal under international law. They claimed that that couldn't go unanswered. And interestingly enough, Israel has targeted, I think, 18 different Iranian military figures in Syria over the last few months and years without any direct reprisal. I think this particular one, because it was a consulate, because of its special nature, that became something that Iran could not turn the other cheek and felt duty bound. What worries me is that the level of response, because I can only imagine if I was here in the UK and I understood that Russia had launched a reprisal attack for something we'd done elsewhere in the world, and that reprisal attack was 331 missiles coming our way, the biggest ever launch of rockets and missiles outside the Ukraine-Russia war, I might think that's rather provocative. And that worries me because you can very quickly see this escalate into a regional war. Now, I say that, my gut says that none of the parties, apart from potentially Israel, want to see that happen. Iran was very clear afterwards. They said, we're drawing a line under it. We've done our reprisal. The proof of the pudding is that most of these there were no casualties on the ground for Israel, apart from one 7-year-old girl. So although there were a lot of missiles, they were taken out, and Iran said, that's it. The trouble is, as you say, is that going to be enough for Netanyahu and his hardline critics who say, if you let Iran get away with this, we've been weakened in the region. We've got to demonstrate our strength. Where does that stop?
Well, I mean, if you follow that, it doesn't stop. History shows that it does. Either peters out or somebody decides they've lost. But it's just, I was just thinking, you were speaking, Sean, these things do seem to follow the same pattern. So we've spoken about 9/11. Now, up to 3,000 people perished in one go. The Twin Towers come down. It was pretty horrendous. I remember watching it live on the TV. But the response to that was massive. I mean, somebody could say disproportionate. But it was anger, wipe them out response. It happened between Israel and Gaza. Now, the attacks by Hamas were pretty horrendous, as you said last week. And if you want to draw equivalence with numbers, what's happened afterwards is massive. You could use the word disproportionate. Same thing with Iran. So maybe, and it's always one person, Netanyahu in Israel, and now it's the Ayatollah in Iran. It's always one person that says, "Go for them, boys." Big. So maybe that's just the way it is with these hyper characters.
One of the things I think I'm acutely aware that we're not good at in the West. We look at these things through a Western lens rather than through a Middle Eastern lens. And you go, what do you mean, Sean? I was chatting to a colleague this week after the event about this proportionality. And he cited an example when he was in Iraq and with the military, and they killed a civilian by accident in a road. Without going into the detail, it was an accident. And there were mobs around that were baying for Western blood. One of their interpreters just said, look, you need to provide blood money. That's how it works over here. How much? $5,000. They found $5,000. Everybody went away happy. They accepted it was. And you go, how does that equate through our lens? I only use it as an example because we don't necessarily feel or operate or think the same way. And the danger of looking for equivalence is I find it very difficult to see 331 drones and missiles as anything other than a hugely disproportionate effort. But look at it from another metric, 1 casualty versus 13 people killed, which is what happened to Iranians as a result of the consulate going. Then all of a sudden you go, yes, through a different lens, did Iran know that with American support and that's one of the reasons why, what does good look like? Iran immediately claimed this was a success. To their domestic audience, they claimed they'd blown up, destroyed, levelled the Nevatim airbase, the base from which the F-35s had been launched for the 1st of October. So they can look good in front of their domestic audience.
No, they control their media anyway.
No, exactly.
So, yeah,
whereas we don't know, but Israelis have turned around and shown pictures of Nevatim with a few big holes in the ground with bulldozers bulldozing them over.
That might be untrue as well.
Correct. We don't know.
No.
But I do know from a military perspective that base is huge and it would be very difficult to take that out.
See, I've heard some other commentators say that the reason Iran went heavy was that Iran's stated aim is to eradicate Israel. The attack on the consulate gave them internationally credible evidence why a response was justified, and therefore, let's go for it. We've always wanted to do this. This is our opportunity.
I don't know. We're into the land of conjecture now. What's been fascinating, though, is that the mood music from the Ayatollah and from America has been, we don't want a war. And the prevailing view is that Iran does not want to give license to Israel and or America to come after their fledgling nuclear program. Because if they do that, from a strategic perspective, that is undoubtedly what Iran wants. Iran, not if, when Iran gets nuclear weapons, God forbid, well, they will have the ultimate deterrence against Israel attacking them or America attacking them. And they know that if they provide them an excuse to go after an act of reprisal, the most obvious place to go is to target the nuclear weapons. So logically, the Ayatollah would know that, and therefore he would not want to start all-out war, which is what the language was. The one thing I can't quite get my head around is the 331, but the very fact that the Ayatollah would have known that America would have swept behind Israel. And this goes back to, remember Lord Cameron, he popped up again this week saying to...
He got a lot of stick as well.
Yeah, but he's saying to Netanyahu, you had a double win here, take it. Don't have another reprisal. And you went, what do you mean a double win? And he said, well, one of which is that your sworn enemy threw everything at you and it didn't get through. Once you've done that, you don't have a second bite of the cherry. So it's proven not to be that, not that effective as well. And secondly, there was a lot of friction between the US and Israel around your approach to Gaza. The US has swung in completely behind you and the UK and others to help you repel this attack. That's repaired the relationship that you had destroyed with the attack on Gaza. So actually, strategically, you've come out of this positively.
Sounds like you think that's common sense language.
Well, I'm trying to find a way of navigating through, is this on the brink of World War III in the Middle East? And I may well be wrong, but it doesn't feel like any of the players want it to be. And therefore, I think that's why this diplomatic effort is going on, to try to pluck these arguments out, try and persuade Netanyahu what to do, and what his options are. But again, it is scary where it might go, but the mood music is that doesn't appear to be what any of the international leaders want.
So I'm just winding back to the beginning. We covered the bombing of the Iranian consulate in Damascus, Syria. And there is a view from some that this breached international law. And, you're generally in touch with this, and you've heard, commentators who, would know have laid this claim against Israel.
Yeah, I think I'm not a lawyer, but it's pretty clear that there's lots of rules of trying to get alignments across the international community at what is inviolate, what should nobody touch. And the whole purpose of embassies is they're meant to be sacrosanct. They're meant to be areas where, despite frictions, we don't necessarily get on with Russia, but we would still keep an embassy in Russia, and Russia is duty bound not to ever walk in there, tackle it, blow it up. And the people that work there are also protected under international law. And it's part of the oil that makes the machine of intergovernmental relationships work. The challenge is this wasn't the embassy, it was the consulate, which is where, if you want to get your passport renewed, it's where the work gets done away from the diplomatic centre. But it's important because it's important particularly because when the Israelis went to the UN Security Council and said, you should lambast Iran for doing this attack, China and Russia turned around and said, hang on a minute, you should have also lambasted Israel for attacking a consulate. That's travesty. So it is important.
Yeah, and there is protection of those premises. Even if there's criminal activity going on, you're still not allowed to attack them. Now, of course, what happened to be, and obviously intelligence revealed this, there were 3 generals in the consulate, and one of them actually ran the Syrian and Lebanese operation for Iran. So, to use your language, 3 high-value targets, and now one would assume that was the reason they went off this particular building, and they achieved their goal. Doesn't justify it. Sean, the Israeli leadership have been in a bunker deciding how to respond to the attack by Iran. Are we getting any closer to understanding what they're about to do, if anything?
One of the things that feels the readout we are getting is they want to do something. There are enough hardliners there that believe that reputation in the Middle East is all about power. And if you take a strike like they have taken and don't do anything, that is a show of weakness. There's also a view, and we can get on to that, is that Israel thinks Iran is pure evil and that sooner or later the world is going to have to wake up and deal with Iran. And if they're prepared to launch 331 missiles, surely now's the time. What is being interesting, though, to counter that, the huge diplomatic efforts going on. Our own British Prime Minister has been urging caution, sit on our hands. The US has been saying, there's no need to retaliate again. You've succeeded. So diplomatic efforts, there's sanctions, so further sanctions against Iran, although the cynics would say that hasn't really proved to be that effective up till now. Is that an overt sign to Iranians and to Israelis that the balance of power is appropriate? So if you go down to 3 options now for the military, you either don't do anything, and we just talked that one through. I think it's unlikely. The other end of the spectrum is you launch an equivalent attack.
What you mean, another 331 missiles?
Yeah, but you launch them against military sites. so that you minimise civilian casualties, that you launch them against the full spectrum of airfields, training facilities, military deployed equipment, radars, surface-to-air missile systems, headquarters, and you potentially also Iranians' nuclear capability, because the argument is that if they're prepared to launch this many missiles and they haven't got a nuclear weapon, what on earth would they do if they had a nuclear weapon? So you've got to stop them doing that. Again, I think that's unlikely, because that would be a trigger for a regional war. There's no doubt about it. Iran would have no alternative but to throw everything at it. The middle ground, the sort of Goldilocks solution, not too big, not too small, something in the middle, feels like a measured attack, potentially not onto Iranian soil, potentially against one of the Iranian proxy groups, potentially in Syria, that's not in a populated area, that's targeting specific leadership or capability, driven by US and Israeli intelligence, so that Netanyahu has the last word, but Iran can sort of deny that it's ever happened, and that therefore for each of the audiences allow both of them to walk away. But as ever, the risk of unintended consequences of these sorts of things is huge.
It doesn't sound like Netanyahu to do something just for the sake of doing it, which doesn't have any strategic value, does it? So, although the last one sounds the safest for us, it doesn't sound like it actually does much for Israel.
No, but again, if we go a layer below this, so one of the questions, rhetorical, is how reliant on America was Israel for repelling those 331 missiles? So America will turn around and say, okay, you might have provoked Iran into doing that. Iran has said, that's it. We were happy to protect you on this occasion, but if you now escalate, we can't be responsible. We can't help you in that, and we can't be responsible for the consequences of that. Now, in reality, would America abandon Israel? Almost certainly not. But I think there's some powerful diplomatic language, potentially behind closed doors, that America can use, because America does not want to see an escalation. So it'll be a real test, I suspect, of Biden's influence over Netanyahu and how much of a compromise that Netanyahu is prepared to make.
Going back to look at the missile strike from Iran or by Iran, it's extraordinary to me that almost all of the missiles were taken out. And if you saw it on the film, you saw, one missile coming this way, one other missile, counter missile, sort of missed it, and the next one got it. It was amazing to watch. But one of the things that fascinates me the most is what happens if you're flying a fighter jet and your job is to take out one or more of these missiles. That seems quite extraordinary. Now, you can speak as a former fighter jet pilot, Sean.
Yeah, I've been chatting to colleagues, including last night, about trying to get a sense of what it's about. It's worth setting some context here. First of all, where fighter pilots, you're fizzing with fear and adrenaline is when you're in enemy territory and you're being targeted. They weren't being targeted here, so their lives weren't directly under threat. The other point is that often the reason you have air-to-air missiles is to shoot down other aircraft. They're optimized for that. Your training is optimized for that. And it's you against another pilot, and one of you is not going to survive that encounter. So it does feel like you've got a 50% chance of living. Again, that was not the case on that night. It was about a measured a way of attacking these missiles. The other context is that you want to have layered defense, so you want to take out these missiles as early as you can. You don't want to leave it to the last minute, because otherwise you just run out of time. But there's a lot of them. So you've also got to coordinate which ones does the Americans take out, which ones do the ships, surface-to-air missiles take out that were in the Red Sea, which ones are the American aircraft going to take out, which ones are the Brit aircraft. So it's got to be prioritized almost certainly geographically. So you've got your box that you're going to operate in with some clear rules of engagement. And most of those boxes are not going to be in Israeli airspace. So you've now got to coordinate with probably Jordan, and Jordanian airspace was probably where most of this stuff was happening. Flying a warplane in Jordanian airspace, that's not simple to do.
And you're not doing this, are you? You're not going, yeah, I got you. Ping.
No. So all of this is being done on a radar. So let's look at the drones first. These Shahed 136 drones, they fly relatively slowly and they're quite small. Why is that important? Because a way a radar works is to stop it picking up cars zipping along the roads and stuff like that, moving targets. It tends to have a gate in it which says if the target's less than a couple hundred miles an hour, it doesn't appear on your radar. That stops all of the clutter from ground vehicles confusing it. Well, of course, a drone is operating about the same speed as a high-speed car. So you've got to adjust your radar to allow more and more of this clutter into the radar screen. Second thing is radars work well by pinging off a metal object. Part of what the Russian experience has been is that they've changed, some of these Shaheds have been painted black, they've had a bit more plastic involved with them. It means they're a bit more difficult to see. So that presents a problem. You then got to decide where you're going to shoot it down because, for example, when you take this Shahed out of the sky, it's going to crash. The warhead is likely still to be intact. It's likely to go off on the ground. So if you shoot it down over a built-up area, a whole load of Jordanians are going to get killed on the ground. That will create all sorts of incident. So it's actually a bit more complicated than just shooting them out of the sky.
It's not a bit more complicated. It's a lot more complicated.
Yeah, and then you've
chaos.
got the issue. It's at night. These things are operating low level. So you're now having to operate at speed in a fighter jet at low level, trying to pick out these things. The next bit is actually the targeting. You've got guns, which I thought they might use air-to-air guns because bullets are cheap and you could shoot them on the drones. No, that is far too risky at night when these things are low to the ground. So they would have used missiles, two main missiles, infrared missiles, which pick up the heat of the engine. So ASRAAM missiles, about 200,000 pound a pop. Very good, out to about 13 miles, Mark 3 speed. But whether these Shahed drones are actually kicking out enough heat to present a target on shore. The other missiles is the AMRAAM, Advanced Medium Range Air-to-Air Missile. That is a radar-laid missile. That can go up to 100 miles. But again, you need a good signature from it. And I think part of the challenge for the pilots would have been to get the missile to identify the target before it whooshes off and destroys it. So there was a huge amount of coordination going on. And with such a large volume, the Typhoons would have had wall-to-wall missiles on, would have been going, right, one, got it, shh, where's the next? Whoosh, taking these things out of the sky. So it would have been incredibly demanding evening, and also of course you've got air-to-air refueling and all of that sort of thing. But I suspect that for the ballistic missiles and the cruise missiles, most of those I suspect were taken out with surface-to-air missile systems rather than air-launched.
I mean, just with one jet taking out some missiles, what you've described is pretty amazing. When you've got 300 to 400 missiles coming inbound, you've got missiles from the Iron Dome coming up into the same sort of space or in that sort of area, that you're going to have fighter jets from 1, 2, 3 countries. You've got refueling planes and refueling going on. You may have some sort of surveillance thing, further up. And you've got stuff arriving in the same airspace from ships. How you manage all of that chaos without having a sort of major accident mid-air is pretty amazing.
Yeah, part of the experience of the last few years in operations, though, is that the military, particularly the air part of the military, is very good at creating airspace control zones, so sectors, three-dimensional, like around an international airport like Heathrow, there's a three-dimensional bubble of airspace that has been designed that you can't go in unless you are talking to somebody radar controlled. The military does a similar sort of thing, and three-dimensionally it looks completely wacky, but it's areas in which certain operations are allowed to be conducted. So, for example, air-to-air refueling will be some way back away from any of the threats of missiles.
Yeah.
The and the fighter jets won't want me to be in the bubble that Iron Dome creates. So Iron Dome will have a range and an engagement zone. That will be a slightly bigger zone than that will be painted, and none of the jets will go into that zone. So that's a sanctuary area for them. The difficult thing is these things take time to generate, coordinate, and then make sure everybody's on the same page. And of course, how much notice would they have had of this happening? So I think the really impressive bit of this is how air power and surface-to-air missiles were coordinated at very short notice, not only by a single service, but multiple services, air, land, and maritime. Also, not just Israel, but actually an international coalition doing it and doing it in international airspace. It was about the most complicated it could be.
And how there wasn't an accident.
How they didn't hit anybody
no
else,
idea.
Bump into anything, how
There's
one
a
of the
lot of
missiles
stuff
didn't get
flying
through.
around.
No, exactly.
From all over the place.
It's a huge testament
Yeah,
to Western air power.
An amazing result as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.